Hi, my name is Melissa Soto, and I'm an associate professor at San Diego State University. And I'd like to welcome you to my presentation for the NCTM 2020 virtual conference. And so I'd like to go ahead and get started. And I'd like to first of all just thank you all so much for being here today. This is the first time I've done a virtual conference like this before, and so I'm excited and nervous at the same time. But I hope that you enjoy. And let's go ahead and get started and have some fun. So I'm going to present here. And so my presentation is how do you solve that? Supporting children's mathematical thinking through questioning. And again, this is my information here, my email address, as well as my Twitter account information if you'd like to follow me. I'm also part of the San Diego Math Project, and we provide professional development to teachers. And we have some resources at the end that I'll have for you, but check us out on Twitter as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So for this session, the goal is really for us to explore different types of questions that we can use to support our students' mathematical thinking. And whether we're posing problems, whether we're monitoring or listening to kids as they explain their thinking or as they're solving problems, or if we're leading discussions, really we want to use questioning as our main tool to transform our classrooms. And what we're going to find is that it's going to provide us with an opportunity to create equitable and sense-making spaces for our students. So our agenda for today is we're going to anticipate and think about some questions as we're analyzing student work samples. I'm going to share a little bit of research on equity, and then I'm going to introduce you to a framework by Jacobs and Empson. And there are 5 different categories for questioning. And then we're going to think about how we might use those types of questions to support students and how can we assess and advance students' understanding and learning. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, we're going to start with anticipations and questioning. So rather than this being a 60-minute presentation where I'm just talking at you, I would like to give us some opportunities to practice and engage. And so that we're going to start right now in engaging in some problem solving. And so I'm going to start by presenting a balloons problem to you. So I'm going to read it first, and then I'm going to ask you some follow-up questions. So Sam has 32 balloons for his party. He puts them into 4 groups with the same number of balloons in each group. How many balloons are in each group? So I'd like for you to take a moment to think about what information do you know in this story problem? So you might have thought, well, I know that I have 32 balloons. And so what does that represent? And so for this particular problem, it's the total number of objects that we have. You might have also noticed that there are 4 groups that he's placing these balloons into. And so these 4 groups represent the number of groups that we have. And so if we know the number of groups and we know the total, what we're trying to figure out is how many items are going to be in each group. And because of this, this is what we would call a partitive division story problem. And so what I'd like for you to think about is how might we adjust this context of the story problem to be more culturally relevant? So if you think about your students, every time we pose a story problem to our students, we really should be thinking about, can our students connect with this particular context? And if not, it's totally okay for you to change the context. We want to keep the same number choices perhaps, or if you have students that may be able to work with larger numbers, you may want to change those numbers, or if they may need a little bit more support, perhaps you change the numbers to be something a little bit smaller. But we do want to keep that partitive division action happening in the story problem. But we could perhaps change the context to be something that includes food or something that may be more relevant to them in their personal lives. So it's really important for us to get to know our students. So what I would like for you to do is just take a moment, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds here in the video to solve the problem. But if you'd like, feel free to pause this video and solve it on your own. But what I'd like for you to do is think about how students might solve this problem in correct and both incorrect ways. And if you would like, feel free to use the Math Learning Center virtual manipulatives. And I have a link here provided on the screen. That can take you to this particular website. And what I'm going to show you is I'm going to go ahead and exit out of the presentation. But what happens is if you go to this website, And what's really lovely about the Math Learning Center is that you can create, what do you know? You can create these links for your students. And as you see, I already have the story problem listed here for you to solve using that particular link. And so what you can do is you can create this link for your students. You can have them solve the problem. You can have them use the manipulatives to pull out these different um, counters. And then once they solve the problem, there's this little square with the arrow coming out. You just click on that, and then you can have a new link that saves your work. And so your students can send that to you if you would like. So this is a really great option for you if you're doing distance learning, or if you're just having students work at their desks. This is another way to get them started. So I'm gonna go ahead and be quiet now, and I'm gonna let you solve this problem, and we'll come back in just a little bit. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and move on. If you need more time, feel free to pause the video to solve this problem. And so one thing that I want to just talk about is this importance of anticipating. And so I asked you to solve this problem before you would pose it to your students, because it's just good practices. And actually, this anticipating is the first step in Smith and Stein's 5 practices for orchestrating productive math discussions. And if you can see, this is the second edition book in the corner that I have here. And what anticipating does for us is that it allows us to really think about how students might solve the story problem or the problem, so that when we are in the moment of teaching, we are better prepared to know what kinds of answers students might give, what types of explanations students might give, so that we are ready on the spot to ask a question and to help support students' thinking. And what Hallman and Thrasher found is that when she was observing pre-service teachers, when they asked questions in the moment of teaching without anticipating, what they tended to do was ask questions that kind of funneled student thinking into a teacher preferred strategy. And that's not what we want to do when it comes to questioning, and especially in mathematics teaching. We want to be sure that we're supporting our students, that we're building off of what they're doing. And so our questions should be building off of their work. And so what Hillman and Thrasher and Spangler found in 2020 was that when we anticipate our solution strategies that kids may solve, both correct and incorrect, it's really going to allow us to prepare for these follow-up questions so that we're better able to respond to students' thinking. And so again, we want to anticipate both correct and incorrect strategies, because we don't want to, when students say something, we don't want to have those, eyes and, deer in the headlights kind of a look. We want to be able to either push students thinking along or help us clarify their understanding, especially if we didn't particularly anticipate a certain strategy. We want to be sure that we have those questions available and ready to go to ask for that clarification. And one thing that's really important about anticipating is that we really need to be sure that we're talking to kids, asking them questions, reading literature. If we're not quite sure how students will anticipate, there's lots of literature out there that can help us help support us in really thinking about how kids might solve these problems. So what I want to do is, so you had the opportunity to solve this problem, and now we're going to take a look at Beatrice. And Beatrice was a second grade student. She was in a bilingual classroom, and her mathematics was taught in Spanish. And so when I interviewed Beatrice, I asked her if she wanted to solve the problems in English or in Spanish, and she said Spanish. So I wrote out the story problem for her to be able to solve. And as she explained her thinking, she actually explained it in English, but I kept the problem the same for her. And so this is her work sample here. And so what I'd like for you to do, again, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to look at her work. And what I want you to think about is, how did she solve this problem? What might she understand based on what she did? And then what exact questions might you ask her? And so I ask for the exact question because sometimes we can say like, oh, I'd like to know more about her counting, or how did she draw this picture? But what we want to do is we want to practice writing those exact questions, so that when we are with our students, we want to be able to have those questions kind of practice and then be able to pose those in the moment. And so take a few minutes to write those down and maybe on a piece of paper nearby. And then what I'd like for you to do is also to think about what was your rationale for that particular question. So I'll go ahead and stop, let you analyze, and feel free to pause the video if you need more time. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. But again, feel free to pause the video if you need some more time. So in the previous slide, we just saw Beatrice's final work sample. And if you noticed, it was sort of this static work sample. It was of her final product. But in actuality, what I have is I have a screencast of Beatrice's work. And what a screencast is a video recording of everything that's on the screen, everything that's said. And actually what you're seeing right now of me is a screencast. And so I asked Beatrice to create a screencast of her solving this particular problem. And so I want us to watch it, but as we watch, here are some things that I'd like for you to consider. First, I want you to think about what new questions come up for you and what new questions do you have for Beatrice after watching her solve this problem? Also, what do you notice and what do you wonder? And so I'm going to go ahead and play this video and let's hopefully oops, I forgot the captions here. Let's watch this video and see how she solves this problem.
So 4 groups he wants. 32 balloons in total. So I might do 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I'm going to make the total. 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 29, 30, 31, 32. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. 31, 32. I'm all done.
I absolutely love this particular video of Beatrice because I love how confident she is. And especially at the end when she sort of has this realization that she may have missed something, she kind of keeps on going. But then at the end, she's super proud of herself. I'm all done. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of run through a little bit of things that stood out to me in that particular video. Let me see if I can stop this for a moment and then see if it will. Yeah. So the first thing that we notice is that Beatrice, let's see if I can bring this back on. So the first thing that we notice is that Beatrice creates these 4 quadrants. And so we just can assume that this is perhaps these 4 groups that she's trying to create. And then as she continues on, she did a lovely job of starting off by distributing out 4 balloons at a time. Rather than going one by one, she actually thought ahead a little bit and realized that she can give out kind of these chunks. And so she gave out those 4 chunks to each group. And then we hear her saying, let me check. And so she counts 1, 2, 3, 4. She skips counts and goes to 8 when she gets here. So we can see that she's perhaps is understanding this idea of skip counting. But then we also hear a slight error in her counting where she says 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So she had a slight miscount in her counting. However, she was able to kind of continue on. And then she started to distribute one at a time these tally marks until she got to 32. What was also really clever of her is that she went back to count to see how many she had. And we can see this by the little, let's see if you can see these little dots on her screen. So we see that she's counting these individual dots or individual tally marks, excuse me. And then at the end, she realizes that, oh my goodness, she's only has 30 of them. So she's quite trying to think about, okay, I know I have to give out 32. So what do I do? So she gives out those last final two to this last group. And so we're going to come back to Beatrice, but I just wanted to give an overview of what she did, because what I love about screencasts is that they provide us with additional information that we wouldn't have gotten by just looking at her final work sample. And so I would like to encourage you to think about if you might be willing or able to use screencasts for your students' work. And I have some more resources at the end if you're interested in learning more about screencasting. All right, so let's go to the next screen. All right, so now we're going to focus a little bit about research on equity and inclusion, and really what's the difference between teaching through questioning versus teaching by telling. And so NCTM Taking Action in 2017 stated that teacher questioning is really this main instructional tool educators have to surface student reasoning and understanding so they can build from what students know to develop deeper knowledge and the ability to make important mathematical connections. And so really what we should be doing as teachers is asking lots and lots of questions of our students, and not just to students who solve problems incorrectly, but we want to make this the norm. We want to make it, sometimes I've seen it where I ask a student a question and they get kind of nervous and tense because they believe that they got the answer wrong. And so we want to normalize this idea that we want to ask questions. We're really interested in how students are thinking about these ideas and how are they making sense. We want to be sure that we're bringing those ideas to the surface so that they can be discussed amongst everybody, not just us as teachers, but as amongst the students, and that we're having this dialogue and this conversation so that we're able to make connections between one student's strategy and another student's strategy, because we want them to grow and to develop a really deep understanding of the mathematics. And so thinking again about the importance of questioning, we also need to realize that not all questions are the same. And in our classroom, we really want to be sure that we're focusing on questions that go beyond just gathering information, thinking about like the procedure. So how did the students solve? What operations did they use? And also we want to go beyond the correct answers. To me, when I interview kids, I tell them, I don't care what your answer is. I'm really interested in what's going on in your head. How did you figure that out? How did you solve that? And so I think, again, we want to make that the norm, that it's not about the answers, that it's really about the process. And so really questions should provide opportunities for students to engage in discussions. As you can see in this little picture down here, I have these students brainstorming ideas, right? We want to bring out these ideas that students have because we want to make the mathematics visible. We want students to be able to see what's going on inside of their heads. We also want to press for those justifications. Like it's not just about, how did they do that, but why? Why did they decide? Why did Beatrice decide to make that 4 quadrants at the beginning? Why did she decide to do some of these things that she did to solve this problem? And also, we want to bring out these ideas because we want kids to engage in the reasoning of others. We really want them to consider and to make connections between each other's ideas and solution strategies. So again, questioning is so, so important. But on the other hand, we also need to be very careful when we are questioning students, because there is this underlying power and status structure system that's happening in our classrooms. So this quote here is, putting one's mathematical ideas and strategies into public view for examination can put students in vulnerable positions as related to issues of power and status structures among students in the classrooms. So we really want to be sure that when we are asking questions, that we are truly curious about students' thinking, and that we're not trying to catch students or we really are, we want to, we really are curious about their thinking. We want to highlight some mathematical thinking that's really beautiful and excellent, but also we want to highlight sometimes questions or partial understandings that kids may have, because there may be other students in the class that that are too afraid to perhaps ask those particular questions. So we want to be sure that we're creating this positive environment where students feel safe to ask questions and to share their thinking as well. So, as we think about these ideas of power and equity and, and status, here's some questions that we really want to ponder. Are all student ideas and questions heard, valued, and pursued? I think this is really important for us to really think about, examining and reflecting on who's being asked questions, whose answers are being heard. I've seen videos and classrooms where sometimes a student will give a really excellent explanation, but sometimes they're overlooked or they're not heard. And so we really want to be sure that we're valuing all student voices. And we're also thinking about who gets called on to answer questions and why. I think this is something that we really need to think about. If we think about in terms of gender, there's certain students that get called on more than others. Thinking about status, are those students that perhaps have higher status in mathematics, are they being called upon more? Are we calling on students that we know have the right answer because we're running out of time and we need to hurry it up? I think we need to really think about what kind of environment that we're creating and um, how are we sharing with our students what it means to be mathematically proficient. So I think that again, it goes back to that idea that it's not about the answers, but it's really about the thinking and the process. And also thinking about what mathematical ideas are examined and discussed. I think for me, a lot of times I'm really interested in those incorrect answers or in those partial understandings because there's a lot of kids are always trying to figure out how to solve problems and how to make sense of these ideas. And so my kind of like my goal is to really identify what they're thinking about. So are we only examining those correct answers or are we trying to um, understand those partial understandings and support students in making sense of these partial understandings? Because if one student has that partial understanding, perhaps there's multiple students that have the same ideas as well. And also, again, thinking about whose thinking is selected for further inquiry and whose thinking is disregarded. So again, we really want to be sure that we're thinking about who is being asked to solve problems and to share their thinking. I'd also like to kind of push a little bit here as well as some this idea of equity sticks. And if you don't know what equity sticks are, it's this idea of that we get these popsicle sticks and we write each student's name on a popsicle stick. And when we want students to share, we just go collect the little can and we pick out a student's name. I really like to push back on this idea because it causes a lot of anxiety for some students. And also, if we go back to thinking about those 5 practices from Smith and Stein, we really want to be selective on who we pick to share their thinking or ask questions because we have a mathematical goal, and so we want to be able to support that goal. And if we just randomly select students to share ideas, it may or may not lead to our mathematical goal. So it's again really important for us to walk around, to monitor, and really ask questions of students to uncover their thinking so that we can highlight those ideas and push them forward to the class. So what are some different types of questions, and why is it important for us to use different questions during our lesson? So this is where I'm going to begin by looking at some categories for teacher questioning. And so the framework that I'm going to use is Jacob and Empson's categorization of these different questions. And as you can see, the framework is highlighted and underlined. This is a handout that's available to you to look at. So feel free to take notes, but also know that there is a handout that has some of this information. So I'm going to list these briefly here, and then in the next slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these. So the first category of types of questions is questions that we ask to ensure that the child is making sense of the problem. Number 2, exploring the details of the child's existing strategy, encouraging the child to consider other strategies, connecting the child's thinking to symbolic notation, and then number 5, posing a related problem. And so if we start with category number 1, ensuring that the child makes sense of the problem, really what we want to make sure is that we are posing questions that allows students to discuss or think about certain parts of the story problem and to really unpack the context and to highlight what it is that they're trying to solve for. And one thing that we really need to be aware of is that sometimes students provide answers that are really the answers to other questions. And so we really want to be sure that we're asking questions to ensure that this child comprehends what the story problem is asking, so that when we hear those solutions, we can determine, was it that the child heard another question or was thinking about another question, or is there some sort of intervention that needs to take place, or is there something that, maybe they had a small miscalculation, or, so how big of an intervention do we need to provide? But we first need to know, what did the child understand, what did they know about the story problem, before we go into, asking some further questions. So what are some sample questions that we can ask? So we can ask them, what were you thinking when you read this problem? What was pictured in your head, or how did you visualize? Sometimes you might want to ask kids to close their eyes, and as you read the story problem, to help them visualize and think about what's happening in their head as they hear the story. And then asking them, can you retell me the problem in your own words? Or what is it saying to you? So just trying to get them to think about what's happening in the story problem and get them to verbalize that to you so that you know what's happening. The second category is exploring the details of the child's existing strategy. And this particular category actually has 4 subsections. And so I'm going to go through those. So the first one is posing a general starter question. And so this is just a question that just starts the conversation. And as you can see, I have this lovely little star here because this is my go-to question. Every time I talk with kids, I'm always asking sort of this is my go-to question that I always ask. And it's pretty much, how'd you solve this problem? Again, if you think about the title of this presentation, how'd you solve that? So, what did you do first is another question that you can ask. And this is really important also for our youngest of mathematicians. A lot of times our youngest students, they may not know what constitutes an explanation. And so we want to be sure that we're asking them questions to kind of support them in explaining their thinking. And so sometimes, and I love this, and sometimes it drives me nuts as well, when you ask a little kid a question and they're like, I did it in my head. And so it's super cute, but also it's like, okay, but that doesn't really help me figure out how you solve this problem. And so what I like to do then is like, so what did you do first? What number did you start with? And so hopefully that can help support the child and realizing like, okay, I need to like actually tell you what I did, not just like, yeah, I did it in my head, which again is lovely, super fun. But we want to, I tell them, I don't know, I don't have a window into your brain, so you need to tell me. But again, sometimes it's really hard for young children to verbalize what's happening. And so we want to be sure that kids are talking to each other so that they can hear and pick up what other kids are saying, so that they can realize how they might share their thinking. The second kind of subcategory is press for an explanation of specific parts of the strategy. And so this is where we can request, the child to explain or clarify certain parts of their strategy. So one thing we can ask is, I noticed that you did X, and X is going to be something that they did. And so you can ask them, so why did you do that? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And again, I hope what's very clear about these questions is that, especially for this one, you have to be there, you have to know and see the student work sample to be able to ask this type of question, because you need to be able to build off of what the child did to solve the problem. Sticking with this, exploring the details of the existing strategy, this third sub question is linking representations to the story context. And so one of the things that we can ask is, where in their picture, where in their model does it show X? So for example, we could have asked Beatrice, like, where in her picture does she show those 4 groups? Or we can even go back and say, I noticed in the story problem, it talked about, these different number of baskets. Where might that be in your picture? So you can kind of go back and forth. Where in your picture do you see this? Or where, so I noticed this in the story, where might that be in your solution strategy? We also want to, again, expand students' understanding of quantities used during the story problem. And so this is where we might ask the kids to compare one quantity to another one or to estimate their answers. So this is a question, especially when we're dealing with fractions. This might be something where we get to ask students, do you think your answer may be more or less than one? So getting them to think about and compare their solutions with some other quantity. Moving on to category number 3, we're encouraging the child to consider other strategies. So again, so we can ask them to compare one strategy with another or thinking about considering a new strategy. This is really nice if we have a group of students that we can get them to think about and how they can build upon each strategy so that we can push their thinking forward and see the connection between those strategies. That's really important. So is there a second way that you can check? Do you see a relationship between these strategies? Perhaps you see a direct modeling strategy and a counting strategy. And so maybe how do you see the counting in the direct modeling, or how do they count, or trying to get them to see that relationship and comparing those particular strategies. And then also you can perhaps, if you pose different number choices or different problem types, asking the child to maybe use a previous strategy that they used for one question or one number choice and using that for the second number choice or problem, so that they can kind of see how those are connected as well. Our fourth one is connecting the child's thinking to symbolic notation. And this one is, I like this one, but sometimes you need to be a little bit careful when using this. So this is when we ask a child to write numerals or expressions or equations that connect to the story problem or to their strategy. And so we can ask them, can you write the steps that you said with equations? Can you write the equations that match your pictures? One of the reasons why I say we want to be careful is that with this is because we want to be sure that those equations come from the student work samples. So if we pose a problem and then we immediately ask a child to write a number sentence to solve the problem, it may funnel the child to solving it in a specific way. Whereas if we ask them to solve the problem and then write the equation, sometimes again, it's we can have these lovely conversations as to why did they write the number sentence in a certain way versus how the story problem is written. So I just wanted to caution you that sometimes, again, the equation should come from the child's solution strategy. And then the last one is posing a related problem. So we want to ask the child to write or to solve a problem or series of problems and explore their connections. So when we engage students in problem solving, they spend a lot of time solving problems. And so we really want to provide opportunities for them to kind of keep going, right? So they've spent a lot of time, and we don't want to just like, you gave the answer, boom, okay, shut down, move on. There's lots of additional problem solving and mathematics that we can explore. And so one question that I really like to ask, especially for say multiplication problems, are, you solve this problem with, let's say, 10 items in a group. So what if we were to have 11 items in the group? This provides a lot of really interesting kind of thoughts, like, does the child go back and start all the way from the beginning, or do they just go back and add one to their groups and kind of go from there? So it provides a lot of insight into the child's thinking when they solve these particular problems. And then, or maybe we ask them to write a story problem that would match their equation, or to write another problem that goes along with this first problem. And what could be really nice, and a nice way to build community, is if you have students do this and then you have students perhaps share each other's story problems and then they solve each other's story problems, which is really nice. So again, so we have these 5 particular categories, and then I do want to introduce another set of question types, and these are called talk moves. And again, this is underlined and highlighted, so this is another handout that'll be available for you as well. And so what these questions are is really when we're working in a group of students, is we want to, again, engage students in each other's ideas. So we want them to ask, if somebody has provides an explanation, perhaps we ask somebody, does anybody want to add on, or are you thinking, do you have a different perspective? Again, engaging those in each other's engaging in each other's perspectives is a really nice way for kids to think about each other's ideas and to kind of build and make connections between their own ideas. So we're asking if they wanted to add on, and maybe asking them to turn and talk to their neighbor, and you give them a specific thing for them to think about. Like, we really, turn to your neighbor and think about, how did Beatrice go about solving that particular problem? And so providing those opportunities for collaboration is really important for kids. So now that we've talked a little bit about these issues of equity and about these questions, what I'd like for us to do is we're going to go back to Beatrice. And so I've kind of, highlighted her a little bit in our questions, but I want us to go back and think about, you wrote down some questions that you would ask Beatrice. And so now what I want us to do is to think about, what kinds of questions did you ask her? How would you categorize those particular questions? And what other questions might you have based on what we just did? And so here we have again Beatrice's work. And so this is here. So I wanted to ask you to think about, what questions can we ask to make Beatrice's thinking visible to others? And so if we think about this, I think for me, my go-to question would be that category number 2, where it's exploring the existing strategy of students, is I would really ask her, can you tell me how you solved this problem? Again, even though I was there and I watched the video and I was able to see how she solved the problem, I really want her to be able to explain to me in her own words how she solved this problem. A lot of times when students do this, sometimes they catch, little errors that they make, and they're able to correct themselves. And or what students can do sometimes is that they may provide extra details that, that maybe I didn't catch when I was watching them, or maybe I saw something but I interpret it one way but they think of it in a different way. And so I think that that's a really good strategy, again, and it allows other students, if they're listening, to really hear how she solved this problem. One thing I want to ask is, how can we position Beatrice as a sense maker, right? If we looked at her problem, her final solution strategy that we have here in front of us, if we notice she doesn't have an answer, and if we notice also there are different amounts in each of these groups, but she had a really lovely strategy, and she was really had a sophisticated way of solving this problem. And so I would really want to highlight how great of a start that she had, right? So one of my questions would be, going back to that again, sort of exploring the the details of the existing strategies, I would want to push her and press her for a specific part. So I would go back and say, I noticed that you gave 4 tally marks to each group. Why'd you do that? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What was it about the 4 that stood out to you? Or, what in the problem prompted you to give out 4? And so I think that that would be a really lovely way to show others, students, that that was a really good strategy, that you don't have to just go, give one item at a time, but that you can give these multiple items to a particular group. Um, and then what other categories of questions might help us examine her math ideas? Again, because she didn't give an answer, I perhaps would ask her to tell me about the story problem. So tell me about it. What do you notice? And also highlight that part of the question says, or probably part of the story problem says, that there has to be the same number of items in each group, and ask her, do you have the same number of items in each group? What do you think you can do? Like, asking her about her questioning. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you counted those? I may even ask her to think about a different solution strategy. So you solved it this way, which is category number 3. You noticed that you solved it this way. Is there another way that you can solve it? And then compare and see if she's able to catch that she, has these different amounts in each group. So there's lots and lots of different questions that we can ask Beatrice. We don't have to ask one question from each category every time we work with kids. But again, it's really important for us to think about what could be a possible question, and have that sort of in our back pocket ready to pull out. And so I realized that you may have other questions too. So if you want to pause and take a moment to think about, go back and review the questions that you wrote, and then go back and see, can you categorize those questions? Do you notice that maybe you had a lot of questions in, certain categories? What might it look like to ask questions from other categories? Again, we want to be sure that we're providing these variety of questions for students and that we're not constantly asking them the same questions, because it these different questions provide us different information and different opportunities for kids to make sense of their thinking. And so I do want to just share a couple of words from Vicki Jacobs, which is one of the creators of this particular framework that we looked at. And I sent her an email once, and I was asking her some questions. And so she says, the categories help teachers think of options, right? These are options for you when you're engaging with students. These are just different questions that you can ask to highlight different ideas. And so it's a toolbox, right? Like we don't always have a wrench, like we have all these other tools in our toolboxes. And so again, we don't have to use all of these questions all the time. It's just these options that we have. But also in their article that they write, that where they present this framework, what they say is that for this framework to be effective, we need to be sure that that we have built relationships with our students, right? Because we want them to feel safe. We want them to know that we are truly interested in how they are thinking about these ideas, that we truly care about their mathematical ideas and their mathematical thinking. And if we don't have those relationships, they may not feel safe to answer questions. They may not feel that their ideas are valued. And so we really need to be sure that we build these strong relationships with our students so that we can successfully engage in these conversations and engage in these practices. So if we think about so we know about these ideas, these different types of questions. So now, how might we use these questions? And so there's a couple of different ways. And the NCTEM Taking Action books, they talk about these two ways that we can use it. So we can assess student learning, right? So we can ask these questions to assess. And what that means is that these are questions that probe students' thinking, their strategies, and their mathematical ideas. And we can use them to ask for clarification as to how students were thinking, because perhaps we anticipated certain ways that kids would solve the problems, but they solved it in completely different ways. So we might ask for some clarification on how they were thinking, because we weren't quite sure or ready for those particular ideas. And one thing that they make very clear is that the teacher stays to hear the answers to these questions, right? So we're actively, questioning, listening. We might take this information as well to help us decide who we want to share with the class or what ideas we want to highlight. So again, it's really important for us to listen and to hear what students say and to really understand and interpret their thinking. So we can assess students' thinking, and we can also advance student thinking. And what does that mean? Advancing questions, they build on the students' knowledge and they try to move students beyond where they currently are. So perhaps you see students that are using a direct modeling strategy. And a direct modeling strategy is when students are following the action and they're representing each of those quantities. But perhaps the numbers are really large and you see students direct modeling by one. So they're drawing circles, or the dreaded little dots where they're just kind of, putting dots all over the paper and the screen. We would perhaps want kids to think about what other ways can we represent these. So we might ask some advancing questions to think about how might you represent those in a different way. And so what's different about these types of questions, again, is that we want to help kind of move kids forward. And what teachers can do is they can walk away and they can leave the child to kind of think and process. But one thing that's really important is that we want to be sure that we come back, right? So we don't want to just leave the students and say, like, you should think about this, and then never check back in with them. We want to be sure that we're coming back to talk to the child to get some idea of how they're thinking about these ideas. So again, so if we have our assessing is we stay, advancing, we walk away and come back. So one of the things that I wanted to also provide for you is some continued practice. So if you want to practice a little bit more about some question of thinking about questioning, there is a handout that has 5 additional student work samples that you can analyze to think about how the kids are solving these problems. And what I would like for you to do is to think about what assessing and or advancing questions would you ask each child to surface their understanding and reasoning? And then categorize those questions. But if you don't want to use the student work samples that I have, maybe you try it out with your own student work. Maybe you have some student work samples that are available that you've provided to your students. So why don't you try to think about what types of questions might you use to try to advance and to assess your students' thinking. Again, this is going to be really meaningful for you because you're right there with the students and in the classroom, and you can even, on the, Monday or whatever day this is, that tomorrow, you can go into your classroom and ask these questions for your students to really, again, anticipate and think about how students are solving these problems. One thing also I want to mention is that when we ask questions, this is a nice way for us to differentiate our instruction with kids. And so, again, we can differentiate our instruction to meet each child's level of understanding. And the way we do that is that we can really ask these questions that can advance our students' thinking. So again, if we go back to this idea of the kids direct modeling by ones when they're larger numbers, one thing we can ask them to think about is how can they represent those objects in different ways and try to support them into thinking about making groups of 10 and then counting on by tens, which is something that, again, in kindergarten, that's one of our standards is that kids are able to count up to 100 by tens. And so we know that they can think about these ideas of 10, so how can we make it more meaningful for them? So again, so we can ask these questions to try to help students move along and to get them to think about other ideas and strategies. So as I come to an end here, which I can't believe I'm almost towards the end here, I have a couple of challenges for you. And so my first challenge is for your next math lesson, I want you to reflect on the questions that you've asked previously. So maybe you've taught this lesson before, and maybe you have some questions that you've thought about, or maybe you just didn't actually think about any kinds of questions. You just kind of taught the lesson and went on from there. So I want you to really reflect on what types of questions you've asked. And again, think about, have you only asked certain types of questions, or have you been able to, ask a variety of questions? If you haven't really thought about your questioning, maybe for your next math lesson, you really plan for for asking really purposeful questions, and also really think about, who are answering these questions. So I want you to reflect on who's answering, and are they, are you happy with that? Are you okay with, only certain students answering your questions, or would you like to invite and have more student voices in your classroom? So really think about who's answering and how might you invite, how might you get other students to engage, and how might you create an environment where students feel safe to be able to respond to questions and to share their thinking. Again, remember that answering questions in a public setting it puts you in a very vulnerable position. So how are we going to ensure that students feel that they can share their ideas, that they can open themselves up to critique and to criticism? Again, don't be afraid to share sort of the partial understandings, because I think it's a really nice way for us to engage the classroom in these ideas, and then to think about, so and so, is thinking this. How can we, find the correct answer, or how can we build upon that, right? So really thinking about how this class as a community can co-construct explanations is really important and could be a nice activity to build community in the classroom. So as a summary again, so we're asking, thinking about, are we asking a variety of question types to engage students in the mathematics and in the ideas and in each other's ideas? So really thinking about this and really getting us to reflect and to think about these ideas, and really thinking about how we can use these assessing and advancing questions to gain more insight into students' thinking and to support their reasoning. Again, we really want to ask questions that build upon students' thinking. I can't tell you how many times I've been doing this now for 11 years, or yeah, 10 plus years. And so every time I interview students and every time I listen back, I sometimes think like, oh, I messed up. I wish I would have asked this question, or, oh my goodness, I totally, took the child's thinking off someplace else because either I didn't know what they were saying, I wasn't fully listening, or maybe I'm like, yeah, that was a good question. So I think of different ways. So again, this isn't easy, right? Questioning is something that, again, I've been doing this for a long time, and I am constantly learning and just getting better and better at. But I also think the more that we listen to kids, the better that we're going to get at questioning. And so I just want to encourage you that even though this is difficult, it's doable, and you can start by just a little bit at a time, even just by going back to that challenge to you, reflecting and thinking about, what, today I'm going to ask two of these different question types. Maybe you're like, what, I tend to just ask a question and then stop. Maybe I pose another problem for students. So just doing one thing for your next class, that's going to be, that's going to make the experience, better for your students. So don't think that it's daunting and that you can't do this. You can do this, and you can just kind of keep going forward, and just a little bit at a time. And again, questioning provides opportunities for us to differentiate and to create these equitable spaces in our classroom. Again, not just questioning the students that get incorrect answers, but are we making it a normal kind of classroom norm that we always ask questions, and maybe engage students in asking questions to each other, so that they can really make sense of each other's ideas, is really important. So again, I mentioned that I was part of the San Diego math project, and so I'd like to just end with this slide with some additional resources. If you are interested in learning more about screencasts, there I did a presentation this summer that talked about screencasts. I've done a lot of research in this area, and so feel free to check it out. There's a QR code there that you can scan. I also did another presentation on supporting number sense with virtual manipulatives. So if you haven't seen those manipulatives before from the Math Learning Center, there's some, I talk about those, and also some additional ones that are out there. You can also go to our website down here, which has more recordings from some of my fellow colleagues as well, about some additional math sessions that we've provided. So again, my name is Dr. Melissa Soto, and I'm an associate professor of math education at San Diego State University. And here's my email. If you have any questions, or if you have any insight into additional questions that you would ask Beatrice, I'd love to hear some of them. Also, feel free to follow me on Twitter. Here's my Twitter handle, and also you can feel free to follow the San Diego Math Project as well. So again, thank you all so very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope that this was helpful for you, and I really hope that you are just as excited about hearing children's mathematical explanations as I am. And again, everybody, please be safe and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.